Hello. This is going to be the first, I think, new video on my channel that is not an album review or a song review, but a list. And I know that this is a very unexpected video, but this is going to be a list of me ranking all the albums from the band Wavves from worst to best. Wavves kind of burst onto the scene in the first half of the 2010s with albums such as King of the Beach, Afraid of Heights, and they never had a big hit. But they built a really big underground following that still lasts to this day. Their influence is hard to keep track of, but I would definitely say that they have played a big role in the giant indie rock movement that kind of was everywhere in the first half of the 2010s. But, over time, Wavves has grown to be one of my favorite artists of the past decade, and I've been listening to a lot of them lately again, and I just felt like I should go through their albums and do a worst to best since I haven't done one yet. The first album I am going to be, the album that's the worst for me, and the ones that are at the bottom at number 7. You're Welcome. This is their most recent studio album, their 2017 album, You're Welcome. My main issues with this album simply come from the fact that it lacks the substance that some of their previous albums had, which made them so memorable. For one, when you compare it to their very early works, and you see how they progressed, this is a very vocal, singing-based album. The main focus isn't necessarily on the crazy instrumentals as much as it is on lyrics and vocals. And on this album, I personally find that the lyrics aren't as interesting. And I feel like the big issue here is that the producing on this album really does not fit the Wavves aesthetic and the Wavves style that by this point I think we had all grown to know pretty well. But even though it was different, I still feel like it could have been executed better. And this is why at number 7 is their most recent album, You're Welcome. At number 6 is 5/V. This album definitely has a lot of the same flaws as You're Welcome, and it is one of their more recent albums, as it came out in 2015. This album is very pop friendly, I'd say. It's definitely like the cleanest, or one of the cleanest and most stripped down versions of the band we had seen up to this point. This album, it was actually praised amongst critics at the time, but I kind of just feel like this album definitely, especially coming off of the hype train that was Afraid of Heights, and even their collaborative album with, I think it's Cloud Nothings, it's like, this album to me, it feels a little underwhelming, and I feel like this is the part where I stop following them as heavy. I don't want to go too much because I really do want to move on to the better stuff. So at number 6 is V, or 5. At number 5 is the album Wavves with 3 V's in there. So Wave, VVVES. So this is their second album. This album came out in 2009, before they really hit big with King of the Beach. And this album, from really all the albums from this point on, I don't have much negative to say. But the main flaws in this album come from the fact that it's an odd transition album between their first album, which is very raw and in your face, and their third album, King of the Beach, which is very organized, structured, and pop-friendly. And I think the reason why this album is kind of a little in that weird area is because it has decent song structures, the songs are definitely a lot more thought out than they are on the first album, but it still has the same rawness as the first album, and I really don't feel like it fits all of the songs. That being said, I feel like this album is a crucial one. I feel like this album is definitely showing the band's progression, and I think that pretty much all of their early stuff aged pretty well over the years, which is why this album is in the top 5, even though there's only 7 albums here. I think this one has actually aged pretty decently. I just think a lot of their work that came after it and even before it is just a bit more intriguing to me. At number 4 is No Life for Me, the collaborative album with Cloud Nothings. I am going to be the first one to admit I don't know much about Cloud Nothings. What I do know is that this album is actually really good. I really like the way that the bands come together with their different styles and sounds and come together with something good. I have heard many collaborative albums that I just think are not that great. I mean, Watch the Throne with Kanye West and I think it's Jay-Z. I know it gets a lot of praise, but I personally find that album to be a great example of two artists that I really don't think mixed that great. And there's a lot of features, too, that I feel like they should have, on paper, worked a lot better than they actually did. But this album, I feel, is very strong. I like the way that it comes together. And this one came out 2015, right? I believe right before 5 came out. And I think the things that stand out to me most about this album is the fact that it does have a much more, pop appeal, but it's far from reaching the levels of that, kind of poppiness that they really reached on You're Welcome in 5, which I'm all for pop as long as it's done correctly. But I just feel like those more recent albums have a lot of flaws in them. But this album, it executed it really good. It has that raw production that I think made Afraid of Heights such a great album, but it has an undertone to it throughout the entire album that I just find I can't really find on any other Wavves album, which is why it lands at number 4. I do genuinely enjoy this piece of work, and I really enjoy the contributions of Cloud Nothings as well. Now we're at the top 3 albums from Wavves. Let's see. Alright. At number 3, we have the self-titled album, Wavves, from 2008. This album is arguably one of the most important albums that came out that year, and arguably one of the most albums in that half of the decade. This album, in many ways, kind of predicted what was to come musically over the next decade. This album was just kind of started as a little experiment, and that's exactly what this is. This isn't an album that you're going to sit down and know the lyrics to all the songs. There are a lot of songs, the lyrics are, you can't even really hear them because of the way it's produced. But it's the production that makes this thing a top 3 album for me. This album is very raw and in your face, and it's very experimental in the sense that it takes a lot of things that other bands had already done. I mean, a lot of the instrumentation on this thing reminds me of early Modest Mouse, even a lot of Bauhaus, which I have an album right up there hanging. Great album, In the Flat Field. Love Bauhaus. But this album, the self-titled Wavves album, gives me a lot of the same feelings that I get from Bauhaus, from early Modest Mouse, from hardcore punk bands in the 80s, and also some of the more psychedelic stuff from Pink Floyd, such as Interstellar Overdrive and the whole Piper, the Gates of Dawn album. And this album does it uniquely. Because technically anybody can, make an album that sounds like Bauhaus, or makes an album that sounds like Black Flag, or, any hardcore band. But this has, you can already hear the unique features of Wavves bleeding through on this album. A lot of the falsetto vocals, you could hear them distorted throughout this album, and that would end up becoming a signature of Wavves. So this album is definitely a solid top 3 album for me, and I think this album has aged phenomenally. And at number 2, we have The Breakthrough, the big album that just turned 10 years old and they're going on tour. King of the Beach. I know that having this album at number 2 may seem low to some people. I know that this album is a number 1 album for many. But this album is a fantastic album. There isn't much bad to say about this album. And for one, I feel like this thing has a lot of nostalgia with me, considering I'm a teenager, and I was kind of growing up in the late 2000s and early 2010s, to be fair. And I kind of grew up with this album. My older siblings and their friends and some of my, I mean, mainly their friends, were kind of consistently playing music from this album. I remember many summers around the early 2010s just hanging out with them and listening to this album while going to 7-Eleven and getting some Slurpees. And I think that this album has aged in a sense that it doesn't feel as fresh as it did 10 years ago, but it feels definitely of its time, and the song quality has remained consistent, and I definitely appreciate that. It has what is it? The song King of the Beach, which is a big hit for them. And I know throughout this album you have songs. There's actually one, I need to look up the name of it. Yeah, When Will You Come? This song has always stuck out to me as being very, a big leap from their previous album, Wavves with 3 V's. Because they're it's definitely a very soft, very mellow sound and very well produced. That's another thing. The production on King of the Beach is very clean, and the songwriting on this thing is very nice. And what went wrong on Your Welcome went right on King of the Beach. And that's why I have such a hard time with Your Welcome. I feel like it's a album that tried to have the same energy as King of the Beach but fell short. But King of the Beach executed it perfectly, and it was fresh at the time. At a time when you had all these kind of indie rock bands bubbling up. You had Wavves, you had Front Bottoms, you had Foster the People, Fun. You had so many more. There's so many that I can't really think of them right now. Um, Wavves really did this album, King of the Beach, was at the forefront. It was spearheading that movement, arguably. Nevertheless, though, there is one more spot. And the number one album of Wavves to me is Afraid of Heights. This album has aged excellently. At the time, I thought it was great. I think it has aged even better. I think it's the perfect blend between King of the Beach and their first 2 albums. It has the more raw, in your face, and more punk style production than King of the Beach, but it has a lot of the same kind of similar melodies and a lot of the songwriting that went so good on King of the Beach. And all of this comes together to make a fantastic album that, kind of to this day does blow my mind a little bit how good it was executed. An album like this, 2013's Afraid of Heights, is why they're one of my favorite artists of the decade. I kind of find it funny because by 2013, a lot of these earlier bands had started to see mainstream success, and some of them had started to lose some of their roots. But in 2013, Wavves looked at all this and actually looked at their roots and actually had a more raw, album, which was a great surprise. Because as much as I like King of the Beach, I don't think that I would be able to put up with many more albums with that same style. And Afraid of Heights, they haven't beat it to this day, and I think I've come down to the conclusion that they probably won't. But I am hoping, since they've been pretty active touring, that they are going to put out some new material. But Afraid of Heights, across the board, great album. One of the best ones of the 2010s. Probably the best album of 2013. And I think it's a massively underrated album. I see the 5 album and King of the Beach rate pretty highly amongst critics. But oftentimes Afraid of the Heights is kind of like... It was technically, they did have Demons to Lean On, which was a relatively decently successful song, but I wish Afraid of Heights and I wish Wavves altogether got more attention. So that's about it. I am going to put my list in the description below. If you guys like Wavves, comment your ranking of their albums below. And if you've never really listened to Wavves, go listen to them. I recommend Afraid of Heights, King of the Beach, in their first album to start, and then from there you could explore any of the other ones. Well, obviously you don't have to take my advice, but I gotta say, once you start exploring them, they're kind of an addictive band, and they're fun and unique, and one of the greatest artists of the past decade. So that being said, that's about it for this video. Tomorrow I might do a Mac Miller review, although I know I'm going to do a review tomorrow. But I just really wanted to do a list today of one of my favorite bands that I feel doesn't get enough attention. Without that being said, I'm out of here. Good luck, everybody, on life.